something ought to be, and descriptive ethics is what it is. So, and then we talked about normative ethics having three areas. The person's character and motives is virtue ethics. That's what we talked about last time. And the moral agent or the decision maker is the primary factor in determining what the correct action should be. And then the act itself is right or wrong. That's called deontological ethics. And that's rules, principles, laws, and that's what you should follow. And then the consequences, something good or bad, where the end justifies the means. So virtue ethics was pretty much dominated decision making in general, and particularly in medicine, up until the Enlightenment. And then in the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, began to have a movement that said that the universe is fundamentally rational and can be understood through the use of reason alone. Truth can be arrived at through observation and the use of reason, and particularly science. All human life, both social and individual, can be understood in the same way the natural world can be understood. Once understood, human life, both social and individual, can be manipulated or engineered in the same way the natural world can be manipulated or engineered. The human beings can be improved through education and the development of the rational faculties, and religious doctrines have no place in the understanding of the physical and human world. So that brought about really a way of society, and particularly philosophers, looking at the world through human reason and not religious traditions. But if we look at Scripture, 1 Corinthians says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligent of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to those who believed in him." And if we go back several hundred years, and particularly in the universities that developed mainly in Europe, and then some came over to the States, there were three main areas of study. There was theology, medicine, and law. And generally, people that went to the university, often, almost all of them took some theology, and then they either went into medicine or law. We see today those three disciplines are kind of replaced now with philosophy, science, and politics. Now let's look at utilitarianism. That's in that middle category of normative ethics. We have virtue ethics, and then we have we'll come back to deontological ethics. But utilitarianism, there's two main aspects of it. There's consequentialist, teleological. Teleological, I think about like a telescope. You're looking down the line. So it's what happens in the end. So the rightness or wrongness of an act is determined by the goodness or badness of the results that flow from it. It is the end, not the means, that counts. The end justifies the means. So rather than virtue ethics, which concentrates on the person making the decision, or deontological, which is the rules or laws determining it, it's really what's the consequence of it. And then there's another part of utilitarianism has the utility or hedonistic principle, and that the only thing that is good in itself is some specific type of state, pleasure, happiness, welfare. It views pleasure as the sole good and pain as the only evil. But we look at Scripture, says, do we let us do evil that good may result? Their condemnation is deserved. So when we look at in the Enlightenment, particularly those that have this consequentialist view, or what the results is what matters, there's two main characters that come to mind. The first is Jeremy Bentham. He was an English social reformer. He's what's called a hedonistic utilitarianism. He says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. But he's often criticized for being too simplistic. In fact, he sometimes gets determined as to be the pig philosopher, because he would say a pig enjoying his life would constitute a higher moral state than a slightly dissatisfied Socrates. So sometimes he's called, and he was an interesting character. He was, I would say, as many that rise in notoriety, he was very narcissistic. In fact, when he put in his will that when he died, he wanted his body essentially taxidermied, and so his body is actually in the British Museum called Autoicon. And over time, even though the embalming techniques weren't as great back then, his head started to deteriorate. It scared the kids that were coming in. So they replaced it with a wax model. So that, but the torso and the body is actually Bentham. The other main philosopher during this time of the Enlightenment is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is what's called a demonistic utilitarian. He distinguished happiness. Eudaimonia means happiness. Happiness from mere pleasure. He defines happiness in terms of higher order pleasures or satisfactions, intellectual, aesthetic, and social pleasures. He would say it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So, and he's known for, he had some very well-known works. One of them's called On Liberty. He was a real advocate of women's rights. If we look today, probably one of the most prominent utilitarian philosophers is Peter Singer. He's a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. He's strongly utilitarianism, very strong advocate for animal rights. He coined a term called speciesism, which means that we shouldn't distinguish human beings as separate from other animals. That's racist in a sense towards other animals, or speciesism. He had an article about 20 years ago in the Dallas Morning News, and he said, during the next 35 years, the traditional view of the sanctity of human life will collapse under pressure from scientific, technological, and demographic developments. By 2040, it may be that only a rump of hardcore, know-nothing religious fundamentalists will defend the view that every human life from conception to death is sacrosanct. So, we only have, 15 years left before everybody will think that. By the way, I have an interesting statistic. Does anybody know what the smallest cell in the human body is? It's a sperm. You know what the largest cell in the human body is? Female egg. Yeah. If you get on Jeopardy and they ask you that, I want a little.
You want to cut, huh?
I want a little cut. Okay, so let's go to that middle category of deontological ethics, or rules or principles, and probably the most prominent philosopher during this time on this view is Immanuel Kant. Kant's an interesting character. He was born in Königsberg, Germany, which now is Kaliningrad, Russia. And he never traveled more than 30 miles from his hometown in his life. But he's one of the best known philosophers. He developed a principle-based deontological ethics based on reason alone. As you can tell, during the Enlightenment, people were trying to come up with a way of thinking through moral dilemmas without religion. So essentially that's what, so he said that there are some moral duties that do not vary based upon the circumstances. So it's not consequentialist. He called these categorical imperatives. And one of the most, he's best known for, the categorical imperative says that you should treat humans in every case as an end, never as merely a means to an end. Do not use people to get something, no matter how good. So he's a champion of what we now know of, referred to as inherent human dignity, that each individual has a dignity, and you should never use those, whether it's in experiments or slavery or whatever. And it's, that's this concept that mainly came from him and is referred to as inherent human dignity, is in documents like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki, which came out after World War II. And so the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, in the preamble it says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And you can see in our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness comes a lot from this thinking. And if those of you remember the last time I'm a big fan of the Nurses' Code of Ethics. I think it's very well written. In their provision 1, it says, the nurse practices with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of every person. And those of us who are believers would say that we have the image of God, and that's why we have inherent dignity. So it's interesting, when I took a course on church history at Dallas Seminary, I had, I'm blocking on his name now, John Hanna, and we got to Immanuel Kant, and he does not like Kant, and that's for other reasons. I can't remember the details, but something about, he was, it turned a lot of people against religion. In fact, he says if there's a gatekeeper of hell, he thinks it's Kant. And I can't, and coming from the bioethics world, Kant's like a hero. I mean, and it's like, anyway, it was kind of odd, to think that. But Kant is well respected for the deontological ethics, or the rule-based ethics. Now, there's another area actually of normative ethics, that is, determine what's right and wrong, and it's called natural law. And it's interesting, natural law has, although its origins, and I'll go over it in a minute, go way back in ancient times, but it's more commonly associated with the Catholic Church and the Catholic teaching, but it's had a little bit of a comeback. The natural law actually goes back even to the Stoics in the 1st century. Humans have within them a divine spark, a logos spermaticos, rational seed, remember the smallest cells? Anyway, that enables them to discover essential eternal laws necessary for happiness and harmony. And of course, Thomas Aquinas combined the Stoics' position with Aristotle's view that humans have a specific nature, purpose, and function, or theology. So human beings, natural law says human beings have an essential rational nature established by God, who designed us to live and flourish in prescribed ways. Even without knowledge of God, reason, as the essence of our nature, can discover the laws necessary for human flourishing. So you can see this kind of joins even some of that Enlightenment view of you can use human reason to make decisions. The natural laws are universal and unchangeable, and one should use them to judge individual societies and their laws. And we see in Scripture in Romans 2:14-15, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, and their consciences are bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, even now defending them. Now, if we go back to when Justice Clarence Thomas was being evaluated to be on the Supreme Court, does anybody know who the head of the committee was that did most of the questioning and examined him?
Joe Biden.
It was Joe Biden. And so this is, and I tried to find an actual recording or video. I can't, but I do have part of the transcript. So let's start off with when he started. He goes, Judge Thomas, you come before this committee in this time of change with a philosophy different from that which we have seen in any Supreme Court nominee in the last 19 years since I have been in the Senate. For it has been widely discussed and debated in the press, you are an adherent to the view that natural law philosophy should inform the Constitution. Finding out what you mean and you say that you would apply the natural law philosophy to the Constitution is, in my view, the single most important task of this committee, and in my view, your most significant obligation to this committee. So the whole thinking about natural law was a big part of that discussion. Now, in most, like I said, for most of the last, since Aquinas, natural law has been a strong Roman Catholic thinking, and it comes out of the issue is, can you reason your way to God? Now, Scripture tells us that by nature, by observing nature, you can say that there is a God, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to get to God, or that's not adequate. And that gets into the concept of how much our mind is depraved by the fall. So in the last 20 years or so, there's been kind of a resurgence in Protestantism, particularly in the Reformed movement, about natural law. And one of the stronger advocates of that is David Van Drunen. And I think he was a graduate of Trinity. He got his THM, Trinity in Deerfield. But he's now at, let's see, he's now at Westminster Seminary in California. And he writes, he has several books out. One of them is Natural Law and the Two Kingdoms, and I'll discuss that. But if we look at how he describes natural law, is that it's rooted in the image of God. All humans being made in God's image have an innate moral awareness. And it's universally known. Even non-Christians have a basic understanding of right and wrong, as we saw in Romans. It's the foundational for civil justice. It provides a shared moral framework for public life and law, enabling peaceful coexistence in pluralistic societies. It's not salvific. It does not lead to salvation, but reveals human accountability and points to the need for grace. And it can be a tool for Christian engagement. It allows believers to reason with non-believers in the public square using shared moral intuitions. Now, what he describes as the two kingdoms framework. And the first one he says is the common kingdom, similar to what we just talked about. It's established in the Noahic covenant in Genesis 9 after Noah was saved and he with the rainbow, and he gave a covenant to man. It includes all people, believers and non-believers alike. It's governed by natural law, not scripture, the common kingdom. Institutions like government, business, and education belong here. Its purpose is to preserve order and justice in a fallen world. And he contrasts that with the redemptive kingdom, established through the Abrahamic covenant and fulfilled in Christ. It's made up of God's people, the church, governed by scripture and centered in grace, worship, and discipleship. Its purpose is salvation and spiritual transformation. So, in fact, I just gave Bob a thumb drive that had all the lectures from the Evangelical Theological Society they had last November. he'll have that finished by next week. But there's a section on natural law, and Van Druden and David Haynes, and there's a couple others that are strong proponents of the natural law theory in Protestant Christianity, like I said, particularly for some reason in the Reformed movement have kind of caught on to this. So it's catching on. In the bioethics world, as you know, Roman Catholic teaching has don't agree with from their salvation and some of their theology, but they're pretty strong in the bioethics world, and both with virtue ethics and now with this natural theology or natural law, which is, there's natural law and there's natural theology. You have to be, the natural theology sometimes talks about, can you reach God through nature or not? But the natural law, which is more just saying there are certain things that are right and certain things that we shouldn't do that are wrong, and all society should be able to function with that. And just to show that some of that terminology is used as far as the different categories, this is a book review about owning the genome, a moral analysis of DNA patenting. So as you find certain genes, is it moral, is it appropriate to patent a gene, a human gene, and use, whether it's in testing or making a drug or so forth. And so this is a review of, it says he addresses both deontological arguments, DNA patents are inherently moral or immoral, that's the law-based or rule-based, and consequentialist arguments, DNA patents are moral or immoral because of their consequences, but it is the consequentialist arguments, both pro and con, that Resnick ultimately thinks that matter. So even though we throw around these philosophical words, they actually are used in discussions. And as you would expect in the secular world, the consequentialist arguments tend to be quite strong. The end justifies the means. Now, in medical ethics, interesting, it was, and I'll show you in a minute, it was kind of spared some of that Enlightenment theory, particularly based on one person. It's an interesting scenario. But for several thousand years, it was the Hippocratic Oath that really dominated medical ethics. And it's really more referred to as the Hippocratic tradition of Western medicine. And it says, as to diseases, make a habit of two things, to help or at least do no harm. Now, most people think that do no harm is in the Hippocratic Oath. It's actually not directly. It comes from Hippocrates' work called Epidemics. But it leads to common medical ethics principles, the principle of beneficence, to help, and non-maleficence, or do no harm. And it's often referred to as the Latin phrase prima non nocere, first do no harm. Now today in our litigious society, we often have first admit no harm. So it's changed a little bit. So in the Hippocratic Oath, which I'll go over, some of you have read it, others don't. People talk about it a lot, but not everybody's read it. We look at the Hippocratic Oath. Hippocrates is the most famous of all physicians, of whom almost nothing is known. It's kind of a myth. And so who wrote the Hippocratic Oath? Ludwig Edelstein in 1943 wrote a thesis, and he researched this, and he was convinced, and I think I kind of agree with him, as most people do, that it was the Pythagorean school of philosophy that had an influence and maybe even wrote this. Now, I do have a gift card for anybody who can tell me what the Pythagorean theorem is, if we remember from it. Yeah, some kind of mathematical thing. Oh, you get his gift card. You get But the Pythagoreans were an interesting group. They stood alone against suicide and abortion. They felt that the embryo was animate from the moment of conception. And so, and the Hippocratic Oath was adopted by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It was a basis of Western medical ethics for over 2,000 years. So it starts off, and of course the first, has to do with, I swear by Apollo, physician, and Asclepius, and Hygeia, and Panacea, and all the gods and goddesses, making them my witnesses, that I will fulfill, according to my ability and judgment, this oath and covenant. Those gods were those had to do with healing, and that's why he used those as people to swear by. He says, to hold him who has taught me this art as equal to my parents, and to live my life in partnership with him, and if he is in the need of money, to give him a share of mine, and to regard his offspring as equal to my brothers, and of course in male lineage, sorry women, and to teach them this art if they desire to learn it without fee and covenant. Well, I think that no longer exists. But to give a share of precepts and oral instruction and all the other learning to my sons and the sons of them who has instructed me, to pupils who have signed the covenant and have taken the oath according to the medical law, but to no one else. I will apply dietetic measures for the benefit of the sick according to my ability and judgment. I will keep them from harm and injustice. Now, this is where it's interesting. I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asks for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. Similarly, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy. In purity and holiness, I will guard my life and art. So you can see it clearly is opposed to assisted suicide and abortion. I will not use the knife, even on sufferers from stone, but will withdraw in favor of such men as engage in this work. That's an interesting thought, because a lot of people's medical licenses will say physician and surgeon, because physicians were distinguished from surgeons. And even in England, they refer to physicians as doctor and surgeons as Mr. And the surgeons don't mind. They consider that, as kind of a status symbol. But that goes way back even to the Hippocratic Oath, where surgeons were more craftsmen. They were like carpenters and plumbers and, barber surgeons and so forth. So that's where this comes from. And it says, then whenever houses I may visit, I will come for the benefit of the sick, remaining free of all intentional injustice, of all mischief, and in particular of sexual relations with both female and male persons, be they free or slaves. So physicians should not get involved sexually with his patients, and whether they're male, female, free, or slaves. And also the confidentiality, what I may see and hear in the course of the treatment, or even outside of the treatment in regard to the life of men, which on no account one must spread abroad, I will keep to myself, holding such things shameful to be spoken about. If I fulfill this oath and do not violate it, may it be granted to me to enjoy life and art, being honored with fame among all men for all time to come. If I transgress it and swear falsely, may the opposite fall my lot. So the Hippocratic Oath talks about beneficence, benefit the sick, non-maleficence, do no harm, avoid harm, abstain from sexual relations with patients, do not discriminate between male, female, slave, or free, prohibits physician-assisted suicide, prohibits abortion, refer patients to experts when indicated. If somebody needs a surgeon, you refer to a surgeon. Of course, that gets expanded into other specialties that we have now, and keep patient confidentiality. So you could see it was actually, other than praising some of the gods, it had it's a fairly sound document. If we look at Margaret Mead, famous social anthropologist, she said it marked one of the turning points in the history of man. For the first time in our tradition, there was a complete separation between killing and curing, one profession dedicated completely to life under all circumstances, regardless of rank, age, or intellect, the life of a slave, the life of the emperor, the life of a foreign man, the life of a defective child. But society is always attempting to make the physician into a killer, to kill the defective child at birth, to leave the sleeping pills beside the bed of the cancer patient. So see that the Hippocratic Oath even is still, to be a very good document. And it's interesting, everybody talks about all physicians, I swear, they all take the Hippocratic Oath. Well, they really don't, because no medical school gives this exact version of the Hippocratic Oath, particularly in this day and age with abortion and physician-assisted suicide. So they come up with variants of it, leave out certain things. Some places have the students make up their own oath and give it. Mm-hmm. So that gets back when we'll talk about the descriptive ethics, about making up your own oath. But so in the medical world, as I talked about, they kind of were able to, for a while, avoid some of that Enlightenment thinking, because they had a strong virtue ethic, strong Hippocratic tradition. And then England and Manchester experienced a heavy outbreak of typhus and typhoid. And at that time, hospitals, it's almost like today how hospitals have hospitalists, that they're the ones that rather than your private doctor coming in. And the hospital hired those as physicians to run the hospital. So there was an outbreak of typhus and typhoid that was overwhelming the hospital. And so the trustees of the Manchester Infirmary or hospital decided to just double the medical staff. They decided to hire, well, of course, the incumbent physicians didn't like that because it was too much competition. And so they resigned en masse. So they went on strike, basically. So there was a crisis. And so what they did was Dr. Thomas Percival was asked by the trustees and the physicians as kind of a mediator to provide guidance on what to do. Now, who was Thomas Percival? Thomas Percival was a classically educated English gentleman. So as we know, an English gentleman, the virtue ethics. He was interested in ethics and theology. He was a religious dissenter and studied at Edinburgh. Religious dissenter means that he wasn't a member of the Church of England. So he couldn't go to Oxford, Cambridge. He had to go to Scotland to study. He was acquainted with Hume at Edinburgh, but disagreed with his views on religion. I didn't go into it, but Hume was one of the Enlightenment philosophers. A lot of that anti-religious thinking. So he disagreed. Percival felt that philosophy and theology were complementary. He got his MD degree from the University of Leiden. He wrote, at the time, A Father's Instructions. They're moral tales and reflections. They're like parables for children. So based on character building, modeling. And so he was known for having a book that was well known at that time. And so he was able to calm down, and they came up with an agreeable resolution to the dilemma. But out of his work and study, he actually wrote a book called Medical Ethics. It was one of the first newer, other than the Hippocratic Oath, book. And I actually have not an original, but I do have a copy of it called Medical Ethics. And if we look at the AMA Code of Ethics, AMA, I think, founded about 1847. And the first Code of Ethics of the AMA was Percival's book. That was actually, and if you look at the most recent version of it, you'll see in the preface here they're talking about that. So that was, so he was able to set another pace by somebody who was a Christian virtue ethicist, and he was able to move the medical profession to kind of avoid, again, some of that Enlightenment thinking. So we talked about normative ethics, what that acknowledges that there is a right and wrong, and what are the ways to find out what's right and wrong. Virtue ethics, deontological rules, consequentialist, and justifies the means, and natural law. So descriptive medical ethics, there's cultural relativism. Different cultures have different standards of right and wrong. One in Rome, do as the Romans do. There's ethical subjectivism. What is right for you is right, and what is right for me is right, and what is right for you is right. That's postmodern. You can have simultaneous different views coexisting together. Well, I think that's right. I think that's all right. There's no absolute. Right. And then probably one that's really what happens today is conventionalism. Cultural acceptance determines morality. And boy, there's no place we can see that more than in the U.S. It's like, well, we used to think, abortion was wrong. Now we don't. We used to think assisted suicide was wrong. Now we don't. We used to think that homosexuality was wrong. Now we don't. We used to think, we didn't even think that transgenderism, but now it's there. And so, well, it's not so bad, or we can have, so that's basically what people think. The general idea is what kind of how we should determine what's right and what's wrong. The problem with that, in addition to from a Christian view, is what happens when you have it's bad enough in our society, but what happens when you have doctors in Germany in World War II in the country, they decided we'd have eugenics and we can experiment on people, and particularly we want to get rid of the disabled, we want to sterilize those who might have genetic diseases or mental illness. And so people thought for a minute, well, maybe there is an absolute right and absolute wrong. And the Nuremberg trials, out of that came the Nuremberg Code, which again reiterates some of the essence of what's right and what's wrong. There are certain things you should do, certain things you shouldn't do. So what are we faced with today? In the world of medicine, Dr. Percival is not exactly as influential as he was, and we still have particularly this concept and justifies the means. And so how do we come up with, in the secular medical world, approaches to bioethics? So there's two main lines of thinking of secular approaches to bioethics. One is championed by Bishop and Childress. They were philosophers at Georgetown. They wrote what's called Principles of Biomedical Ethics, and they kind of go a little bit more towards the modern Enlightenment approach, where they say we should be able to develop in our society kind of a mixture, whether it's natural law, consequentialist, rule-based, they're put together. We should be able to come up with a code that medicine should be value neutral, but we should be able to have principles that should guide us. So it's a principle base. It's often referred to as principlism. That's that law-based, deontological. And the four principles they came up with was autonomy, self-determination, beneficence, to do good, non-maleficence, do no harm, and justice, which is loyalty and fairness. But it's difficult to get everybody to agree on that. The other approach is by Tristan Engelhardt. He passed away a couple years ago, but he was actually in Houston, I think. He was at Rice. But he was a very well-known Christian philosopher. He was very big in the Antiochian Orthodox Church. He thought that was the true church of the Eastern division, and but he was the editor of a journal called Christian Bioethics, and he calls it a non-ecumenical journal. And what it was a journal, and he had textbooks too on Christian bioethics, and he feels that in that journal, he allowed people to write articles from a Christian perspective rather than trying to come up with the universal approach, he encouraged people to say, well, from our tradition, and here's the reason we think whether this is right and this is wrong. And so his book was The Foundation of Bioethics. And so he has what's called, for lack of a better word, a libertarian approach. He said that we should be able to coexist and be able to allow individual groups to be able to practice according to their conscience and their moral tradition. And I don't think I have it in here. I have a slide that talks about some of his. He says you should be able to have fanatic care, which is where you can have everything you want done, or Vaticare, which is the Catholic view. And he says, and then you ought to be able to go on a Club Dead cruise, where you go on a cruise and at the end you all drink the Kool-Aid. Anyway, he was joking, but he was actually. But what he said is that we shouldn't impose a universal moral code on society, and particularly he's talking about in America, but not necessarily all nations. But if you want to have a Catholic hospital and they don't want to do abortions or even tubal ligations, they should be allowed to have that. And rather than trying to have a one size fits all. So he says we're moral strangers in a pluralistic society, and the only secular moral authority is consent. So people should be able to be allowed to say yes or no, and yes or no, both from the patient and the physician. So he was a big advocate of conscience clauses for physicians. That physicians should be allowed to have certain things that they're not going to do, and it shouldn't adversely affect their privileges at a hospital, or whether they get board certified in OB-GYN because they won't do abortions or whatever. And so we should be able to live peaceably with moral diversity. So although I kind of like that approach, and as you would imagine, the previous approach, which is that secular, we should be able to come up with a view that we all agree on, and not have it based on any kind of moral code, is unfortunately becoming more the dominant position. So let's look at what are the distinctives of Christian bioethics. I think Christian bioethics is Hippocratic in orientation. It views medicine as a covenant relationship, not as a contract. And so human dignity exists from conception to natural death. All truth is God's truth. Science is a sacred trust. Technology must be directed in morally responsible paths. We look at it's interesting to look at the Christian history. H.E. Sechrist was an eminent Jewish medical historian, and he wrote, "The most important and decisive development in the special status assigned to the sick was introduced by Christianity. This new teaching, in contrast to other religions for the healthy and just man, appealed to the sick, to the weak, and to the crippled. It spoke of spiritual healing, but it also spoke of bodily healing." So now, I think some of you have seen this before, but there's about every year you come out with a new version of the Bible, right? There's this version, English Standard. The medical profession didn't want to be outdone, so we came up with the NMV, the New Medical Version. And here's an excerpt from Genesis. "And God populated the earth with green and yellow vegetables of all kinds, so man and woman would live long, healthy lives. Then Satan created McDonald's, and McDonald's brought forth the 99-cent double cheeseburger. And Satan said to man, 'You want fries with that?' And man said, 'Supersize it.' And man gained pounds. And God created yogurt, healthful and pure. Then Satan froze yogurt and created chocolate fudge and sprinkled toppings, and woman gained pounds. And God brought forth running shoes, and man resolved to lose those extra pounds. Then Satan brought forth cable TV with remote control, so man would not have to toil to change channels, and man gained pounds. Then Satan saw and said, 'It is good,' and man went into cardiac arrest. and God sighed and created quadruple bypass surgery. Then Satan created HMOs. So I think by Christmas the full version will be out, and we'll see if we can get you to subscribe to it. Anyway, just want to finish off on an article. This was an article a while back, a little over 20 years ago, but it was in one of the most prominent cancer journals, the Journal of Clinical Oncology. And it talked about the importance of faith on medical decisions regarding cancer care. So they took patients that had advanced lung cancer, and they wanted to know, they had, I think it's nine people, what would you use to make your decision? So they had a medical oncologist, they had the patient, and the patient's caregiver. And they were to rank the importance of these from what's the most important. You had the cancer doctor's recommendation, the ability of the treatment to cure disease, the side effects, faith in God, family doctor's recommendation, spouse recommendation, children's recommendation. So of course, the patient, of course, is this standard. You want to know, so they interviewed the patients to find out what the control is. So they would say the cancer doctor's recommendation. Number 2 is their faith in God. Then the ability to cure the disease and the side effects, family doctor, spouse, children's recommendation. The caregiver, and this is interesting, had the exact same, which is important because not just in the caregiver, but I know we're talking about a little bit different, but when you pick who's going to be your medical power of attorney that can make decisions for you when you can't make them for yourself, it's important that that person be in sync with what you would want. And so you want not only your caregiver, but the person who can make decisions when you can't, that would do it the way you would. So that's just but they looked at the oncologist, the cancer doctor. Of course, cancer doctor's recommendation, that's no surprise. The ability to cure disease, science. The side effects, again, science. The spouse's recommendation, don't want the wife mad at you or the husband. The family doctor, children's recommendation, and last was the faith in God. So it shows that, and people there, and this is emphasized in talks that I would give, or even with the chaplains at our hospital, is that people's faith in God and their spiritual needs are very important, and doctors, treating doctors need to understand that. So by having articles written in reputable medical journals, that's the way you get doctors' attention. It has to be in a peer-reviewed journal, so then you can talk to them on equal level. So that was kind of the approach I made, but it's an interesting theory. So anyway, that's kind of just an overview of how ethics is categorized, how it affects the medical profession, and where we are. Anyway, so questions, comments?
I have a question. You mentioned earlier something about the morals and law of making a patent on the genetic code, right? I don't know when that was, but I know that I read a book about Henrietta Lack.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was all about, she had
a cell line, a cancer cell line.
And she was poverty, and the doctors knew she had this, and it helped cure cancer, and her family got nothing. So just wanted to, when did that happen? When was that about?
Well,
that
patent article was like 2003, but it was mainly just to show the language. But that's a problem that you get into of.
Who owns that, right?
Well, you actually took the words out of our mouth, because most people, when you get admitted to the hospital and you're going to have surgery and they're going to take something out, you know, you get a stack of papers like this, you got to sign. Somebody's waiting for you. You don't read them. Sorry, don't listen to the lawyer. You know, nobody reads it. You know, you might, but nobody else reads all those things. You just like, you sign them. Well, hidden in there, in the fine print and italics on page 725, says the hospital owns your tissue. Which, you know, of course, being a pathologist, you know, it says that, you know, we own it, we don't, and sometimes people, they want some of it back. You know. It's not uncommon for people, particularly women who've had a miscarriage, they want to bury, sometimes they want to bury the remaining tissue. Which, by the way, we have a deal, or when I say we, I'm retired, so I'm not there anymore, but the Presbyterian Hospital has an arrangement with the funeral home that once a month, we keep all the tissue, all the miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, stillborns, well, below a certain level. Above a certain level, they have to be buried, but below that, they can be disposed of as medical waste. Well, we don't dispose any of it as medical waste. Once a month, the funeral home comes, takes all the tissue, and incinerates and cremates it, brings the ashes back. We contact the families, the mothers, or anybody else to come if they want to come, and then we have a memorial garden, and the ashes are put in this memorial garden, and it's no cost to the patient for that service. Sometimes people want to have their own service or and do that. But anyway, but yes, so if we got a rare, you know, for instance, I wrote a book a while back on you know, female genital tract tumors, GYN, that was my area, and we have all these pictures of ovaries and uterine cancers and all. I took pictures and you know, published that. And of course, I get this great royalty check of about $3.75 a year. It wasn't exactly on the New York Times bestseller, but I didn't have to ask permission from. Now, if there was a picture in the operating room that showed that person, yes, of course you'd have to. But that gets back to your original question, is that what happens is if we got a rare, it's sometimes research place, particularly UT Southwestern, is doing research and they want certain types of cancer, pancreatic cancer, kidney cancer. They want it because they're doing research and they want those cells live. So we, you know, take a piece before we put formaldehyde on it and freeze it in liquid nitrogen. And then they can thaw it out and use it to make, you know, tests for future or make drugs and all that. And so right now, they don't have to have permission for that. So the question gets in, who owns that? And if they were to take some of the DNA of that tumor and find, oh, this is what got defective and turns this into cancer, now we're going to make a drug that attacks that, so that when people get this, they can take this drug, and rather than having all the chemo, it'll go right to the tumor, and you know, so then they're going to make money on it. So I'm not answering your question, I'm just telling you the way it is that it gets difficult to, you know, the morality or the ethics of that, of somebody profiting upon somebody's tumor. But it's kind of been the way it's been, is that you don't, it's a little bit kind of the kissing cousin of donating your organs or something. It's like you're donating your tissue. Now, if we were in a more, I don't get the right word, socialistic society, and it was all for the betterment of people, but these are private companies, and so you get into that issue of, you know, owned by stockholders, and their stock goes up because they found this gene. So the reality of it is it's, to my knowledge, it's still, you know, when you agree to have something removed, you give up ownership of it. So, yeah.
In today's surgery, if a surgeon does surgery on a preteen transgender, is that allowed under current AMA ethical rules? Well,
again, it's similar to a question you asked last time. The AMA doesn't have jurisdiction, but In Texas, it's not allowed. Texas won't, you can,
So it's more government than the AMA, the laws, the rules.
yeah, the rule, medicine is run by each individual state. Each individual state controls the practice of medicine, what you can and cannot do. And so now the federal government can have certain rulings like they did with Roe versus Wade saying that overrules some of that. But in general, whether or not you can take out the reproductive organs of a minor for transgender surgery was, well, I mean, there are some conditions, extremely rare, but sometimes people are born with ambiguous, genitalia, and you have to decide. Let's put that aside for a minute. But what we're talking about is changing a relatively normal biological male to a woman or vice versa. And Texas now has, doesn't allow that, partially due to some legislation. But before then, it was up to the individual hospital for credentialing purposes. They would make a decision, and the ethics committee would decide whether or not that it would be done. But yeah, it's that gets back to in law. Law is deontological ethics. It's law based. It's rule based. It's law. So either it's the act that's important. You can or cannot do this particular procedure. But that's I remember when they first started doing that, I was like, whoa, are you? And then all of a sudden, this is several years ago, Children's Hospital just said, we're not doing it anymore. We're not doing that, we're not giving that. And nobody would answer any questions. I'm sure their lawyers got a hold of them and said, you need to, we see a coming storm coming. You need to get out now. You need to get in your bunker right now before that. So.
The reason I brought that up is being a CPA, we have written ethical rules, and for the most part, they don't vary state to state.
Yeah.
And they're pretty explicit and specific,
Yeah.
so.
Well, the AMA, unfortunately, they go back and forth. For instance, they just recently upheld that they're against physician-assisted suicide, and they still call it physician-assisted suicide because there's a lot of euphemisms, medical aid and dying and this and that. And so they have come out because they've got some Christians on that committee now, the ethics committee of the AMA. So it's kind of turned a little bit more favorable. But it's interesting. The AMA's code of ethics, it's not binding for the practice of medicine, and there's no consequence. The AMA really doesn't have any power. But so it's the local, state medical board that really has the power. Anything else? All right. Well, hope that's been useful.
Thank you.
Did you know that the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is closed? It's going to Canada, or it's joining
college,
Canada. Yeah.
They're just putting it under
Yeah.
TW, TIU.
Yeah.
Which is a good move for them. It'll give them more stability in the long run.
Yeah, I got my bioethics master's there, but it was under the graduate school, not the divinity school. But then they closed the graduate school a couple years ago, and I think they put it under the divinity school. But then now they've actually closed the campus, I guess is what it is, and they've moved it to Canada. Maybe it's good for them, but that was a good place. I hate to see that go, but I guess economics sometimes rules. I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind we started without you. Stan Toussaint said that once. I've always wanted to use it. Okay, well, thanks.
Here, sir.
started at 9.